Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
Matthew Fitzsimmons.
Hey there, how are you doing today?
I am terrific, Molly. Thank you so much for having me on.
That's great. Thank you so much for coming on. And before we get started, I know I already said this to you before, but everyone needs to go and read this book, Constance. It is amazing. Such a great sci-fi, thriller. Impeccable. I'm freaking out over something that I will not spoil that just happened in it. It's really amazing.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you're enjoying it. Probably be horrible to have to interview someone for a podcast and be like, oh my God, your book. I'm not getting through this one. So I'm relieved. I'm very happy to be in that other category.
Luckily, I've had so many amazing authors on here, so I have not had to worry about that. But that is I live in fear of that every time. I'm like, what if I read the book and hate it? What happens then?
Right. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'd want to be in your shoes. Yeah. So good. All right. We're off to a good start. Roaring.
Yes. All right. So can you tell me about your books?
So, yeah, I began as a mystery thriller author. I wrote this is my new one is my sixth book. I've written a 5-book series that would probably be categorized as a more traditional mystery thriller series. It was a series about a Marine hacker. I wanted to write a series that portrayed computers and hacking accurately and authentically, as opposed to the way I saw them in movies, which are sort of, people sitting at keyboards, typing at 1,000 miles an hour and hacking in real time. And I've got a very, very good friend who works for a government contractor here in DC. And he would tell me stories, and this was 6 or 7 years ago. This was before Mr. Robot or some other shows that have started to portray hacking more realistically. And what he described to me was such a patient, careful, slow approach to computer intrusion. And I thought this is a fascinating area that's not really been delved into. So I sort of wrote a character that is, there's a term called social engineering, which is computerese for a con job. And that, what hackers say is that the threat is generally the software, the wetware, not the hardware. And the wetware are the people who do dumb things like have simple passwords or click on links that they shouldn't. Mm-hmm. And that really 21st century hacking is tricking someone into doing something dumb. And it's a con. So I basically wrote a computer con job character who was nominally a force for good, and it was a really fun series to write. Constance is, I want to argue, is still a mystery thriller.
I would say that.
The original idea for it came basically from the question is, how could someone both be the detective and the victim in the same story? How could you be forced to investigate your own murder? And science fiction was really the only way I could see to let myself explore that idea. But at the heart, it remains, we're so caught up in genre definitions, like this is this or this is that. And I think it's much more fluid and more interesting than the sort of those narrow publishing labels. So I still think when people ask me what I wrote, I still say I wrote a mystery thriller, and they say, "Oh no, you wrote a science fiction book." And I said, "Well, there is science fiction in it. It is a science fiction book, but it is at the heart of it a mystery and a woman trying to solve it."
Mm-hmm. I would 100% agree with it being mainly a mystery. And I think some of the best and most inventive books are often ones that kind of defy genre and have a bunch of different elements, because you don't want to read something that is just straightforward the entire time.
Absolutely. And you're starting to see more and more of it. You're starting to see, an author like Nobel Prize winning Kazuo Ishiguro who is one of the, for my money, one of the great novelists of the last 30 years, who has written, and his last three books are two science fiction books, Never Let Me Go and Clara and the Sun. And he wrote a fantasy novel called The Buried Giant. And you're just, I think some of those labels are starting to blur and blend in more interesting ways. I'm really here for it. I love some of the things I'm seeing.
Definitely. I would 100% agree with that. So how did you come to the idea of cloning? Since you said you were trying to figure out like who would be the detective and the victim. How did you land on this?
Well, I mean, it was, so I play a little game with myself where I take sort of a well-worn trope, like the bank heist or or a rescue mission or a murder mystery. Mm-hmm. And I try and think of a way to spin it fresh. And some nights that fails totally, and I can't come up with it. More often than not, it fails. But it's a really good sort of intellectual, sort of grist for the mill, think it through. And one night I posed the question to myself, how could someone solve their own murder? Had it been done before? Had I seen it? There's a great old 50s movie called DOA that was remade in the 80s about a fellow who had been poisoned. He knows he's been poisoned. He knows he's dying, and he tries to figure out who killed him before he dies. That's not quite the same thing. There's a fun movie called Crank in the late 90s with Jason Statham, where he's also given something that's going to kill him. There are some supernatural stories where you got ghosts trying to, the Lonely Bones, maybe. Do I want to say that's in that? Anyway, I don't want to get off inaccurate. I talk about someone else's book inaccurately, but I could think of some supernatural scenarios. But I wanted one that was just I want a living, breathing person investigating their own murder. How could I pull that off? And I thought about it, and I thought about it, and I thought about it, and I got nothing. So I got into bed, and I'm lying there, and I'm falling asleep. It's about 12:30 on like a Tuesday night, and I went, well, what if it was a clone? And I did one of those like sit up, bolt upright in bed movie moves, where like eureka, and I like jumped out of bed.
The lightning, the light bulb up.
Totally, I am such a living cliche, and I like ran to my computer, and I was up most of the night, writing notes, starting the world building. And I actually wrote a chapter of it, which at the time was the first chapter, but which is now, it's now the fourth chapter. And like there are parts of it that are still the same words from that like night, but that was 5 years ago. It was when I was when I was writing my second book, and I was sort of committed to the Gibson Vaughn series. But I said, someday I'm going to write this. And it's always a little bit scary, once you sort of get into a lane, okay, you're a romance novelist, or okay, you write fantasy, or okay, you write mystery thrillers. To say I want to do something out of that lane publishers can be a little wary of, though they finally marketed you as this one thing, and now you want to sit in a different shoebox or whatever you want to call it. But my publisher was very excited about it and was like, yes, let's do this. Let's go for this. And they were hugely supportive of it. So it really just came from a dumb, like, how could I do it? And everything else was eventually in service of that sort of initial idea.
That is really awesome. And that part about the publicist is really cool too, because I know a lot of times with publishers, that can also be a contract that the author has, where it's like, you need to write this many straight up like thriller mystery books.
Right.
And that but that's really amazing that you had that.
I feel very fortunate.
Yeah. So do you think that you will write more in this sort of world? Because it takes a lot of world building to get there.
So we were just wrapping up Constance. We were in final developmental edits for it. And the plan had always for it to be just a standalone. Like I had this idea, I'd written a 5-book series, and I was like, I don't want to just write series. I'd like to sort of like, tackle a fresh idea for a while. And we were in that, and my publisher said, they'd read it, and they'd apparently been talking amongst themselves, and they said, we'd really love it if you wanted to write another one of these. And I went, well, I'm sorry, I don't have another one of these. Like, that wasn't the plan. And they were like, well, that's too bad. I mean, it would be really great, guilt trip. And all right, well, what else do you want to do? And I sent them some pitches for some things. And then about 3 days later, I got in the shower, and I had an idea for another book. And by the time I got out of it, I had the whole thing. So I am, to my surprise, but I'm actually very, very excited about it. I think it's a really interesting extension of the world. I'm writing a companion to Constance called Chance. It is not, I don't know that I would call it a direct sequel. It takes place about 2 years later. But it does. I'm really excited about this. I think I really love the idea for this one. So here we are. Yes, I'm going to extend and continue this world.
That is so cool. And I'm not even done with the book yet. I want more. Like, I'm ready for the next part of this kind of whole story in this world. On that note, I would actually kind of like talk a little bit more about the world building for this and what it was like world building in the realm of like our world, but in the future, because like it's not quite dystopian, because I could still see it be in the future, but like, how did you work on this?
So I read science fiction. I wouldn't say that I am a encyclopedic knowledge of science fiction. My taste in science fiction has always run to the near future. Handmaid's Tale, or Philip K. Dick's work, or William Gibson, sort of something that is similar enough to our own world. Clockwork Orange, books that are sort of are just out of reach, but that you can see us in.
And it makes it so much more unsettling.
For me, it is. I know, there's a whole world of, far future, space empire, science fiction. That has just never been that's never drawn me as much. It feels too distant for me to connect with. And so what was interesting to me about this was, as I got into it and I started to think about human cloning, one of the things I discovered was that there are no federal laws in the United States against human cloning. Human cloning is done every day in this country. In terms of stem cells, we duplicate human cells every single day. And that is human cloning. What we don't do is bring that clone and make a viable human and deliver a baby that is a clone. That is a ethical step that we have heretofore avoided. But there are no federal laws against it. And it's sort of a state by state. There are states that absolutely outlaw it, and there are states that allow it. And they're not always the states that you think they're going to be, based on sort of current political and cultural. It's more varied than you would think. And that idea led me to the.
Oh, wait, one question on the states thing. Sure. I don't really know much about the laws on cloning. But is it similar to, or the same as the ones in the book? And like how it's like, yes, Virginia is more this and California and like that. Thank you. I was just wondering.
No. Absolutely. Fair enough. And what was I going to say? Based on that idea, I was like, well, what if oftentimes in science fiction, the technologies that are in the book have been around for a while, and people are flying cars, and no one's all that surprised by the flying car. And what was interesting to me was, what if we're seeing a new technology that is sort of transformative and revolutionary being introduced to a culture, and how is that culture going to respond to it? How accepting of it are they going to be? How would we react to something as transformative as that? And I thought back to, when I was a kid, in the early 80s, there was the first child that was delivered using in vitro fertilization. Something that's done now in this country millions of times. But at the time, it sent a shockwave through America, and someone very clever, or someone who thought they were very clever, called that child a test tube baby. And there was much hand wringing, and what does this mean for, is this really a person? Is this really what is intended? And for a long time, in vitro fertilization was treated as suspect and suspicious and maybe dangerous. And over time, it's sort of become something that we just sort of take for granted as an available technology. So what about cloning? How would the world of this book be? Basically, the company that does human cloning is founded in 2020, but doesn't really come to market until 2032, so about 10 years from now. And then by 2040, it's out, and there are going to be all sorts of forces and opinions around it. And that was really the basis for the world building, was how to ground this in a way that would feel, how would Americans react to this? And that was a really interesting intellectual exercise to sort of just daydream and world build about it. It was so much fun to dig in and read about it and think about it and try and come up with something plausible and believable and grounded.
And I really love how you did that too. And there were some parts of it that were just so, I think chilling is the only word I can really use to describe it. Like when I'm not going to spoil, but she sees a few people that she thinks she trusts. And it's like the level of, it's almost racism, but it's clones. So it's not that, but it's like that level of like the shock. It hits you so hard, even though it's like, well, this person isn't a part of this super alt, like the children of Adam, that group in the book.
Right.
There's still this underlying tension.
Yeah, prejudice is an interesting thing, and also often it is based on ignorance. And oftentimes the thing that people are prejudiced against are towards a group of people that they have no real interaction with, that they only see from a great distance. And that was sort of that's true of the clones in the book, is that there aren't actually that many of them in the grand scheme of things, that most people have never met a clone, have never interacted with one, and yet have incredibly strong feelings about them nonetheless. And I thought I think that's a very true of human nature. We're afraid of what we don't know, or what we're unfamiliar with. And I was very I know the part of the book you're talking about, that was a really, it doesn't play necessarily a huge plot point in the book, but it was essential to establishing her new reality. This is what your new world is going to experience, is going to be. And it's a wake up call for her, I think.
Yeah, really. So kind of switching directions here. What made you want to be an author?
That is an excellent question. I mean, that's a long story. I'm gonna try and shave off several hours of that. I'd like to say that I'm an overnight success, 20 some years in the making. For a long time, when I was a much younger man than I am now, my dream was to be in the theater and to be a theater director and to direct plays. And I went to New York after college and I directed a few off Broadway plays and worked in the theater for a couple of years. And it was not for me. And I still wanted a career in the arts and I still wanted a career in storytelling. And I had the not great idea that writing a novel would be like directing a play, only the actors wouldn't talk back to me. I would have total control and I would like to go back and slap my 24-year-old self really, really hard and say, that's not how that works at all. They are not comparable mediums, you fool. And I spent a good amount of my 20s writing a novel. Spent 4 years. I waited tables. I was a starving artist. And when I was done, it was not very good and it was not sellable. And I quit. I was nearing 30 and I had taken my shot and I'd missed. And that happens sometimes in the arts. You take you go for it, and you hear the stories about Chris Pratt, who is living down in a van by the river with his buddies, and then the next day he's on a TV show, and you hear those stories. The stories you don't hear are all the people who try and make it and don't. And then what do you do? And I was one of those. I was Chris Pratt's friends who didn't get cast on Parks and Rec. And I was sort of done with writing. And then about 8 or 9 years ago, I started to get the bug again and I started writing and I didn't tell anyone. And it was my little secret. It was because I was almost ashamed of it. I didn't want anyone to know that I was messing around with that again. And out of it came my first book, The Short Drop. And it was sort of my last, I don't know what on earth possessed me. It was not a good idea. It was not a good investment of time, but I something in me was like, no, I have to try this one more time to see whether I can do it. And I got very, very lucky. And so some 20 some years after I sat down to write a book, I finally finished one that an agent was willing to take a chance on, and we found a publisher, and I have been writing ever since. And if with a little luck, I'll get to do it for a number of years to come, because it really is, to be a cliche about it, again, it's a dream come true. I feel very fortunate and very lucky.
That is so incredible. And to me personally, at least, stories like that are the most inspiring, because you put in the work and it didn't work out at first, and then it did.
I mean, the amazing thing is when you go, so when I went to my first conference, and you start meeting other authors, they all have stories like this. The number of people who sit down and write their first book and it's bought, we know those stories and we know those names. But, you go back to someone like Stephen King. I mean, he had a box full of rejections. No one knew what to do with him. How many publishers rejected Harry Potter? It's a gamble and a commitment to yourself that may or may not pay off, and it's a very scary place to be.
I just had an author on here, a brilliant author, Samantha Downing, and she wrote, I believe it was 11 novels.
Yep.
Before she published the first one.
Yeah, you hear those stories all the time. And I mean, so my story is not all that impressive. I wrote one book and I wussed out and I ran away from it. And then I came back and I wrote. So in the grand scheme of things, I had it relatively easy. I mean, I am so awe-inspired by people like Miss Downing, who, the commitment and the love to write 10 books, to figure it out, to find the one, to get across that finish line it's just awe-inspiring.
Well, I think yours is equally inspiring, at least to me, who's someone that tries to write and then goes through phases where it's like, I cannot write forever. And then I start again, and then I can't write forever. And then like it's showing the commitment and coming back to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you did like that first book that was not published, was it a thriller? Were you already working in this genre and in this space, or no?
No, I mean that's the funny part of it is no. My first book was going to be the non-existent great American novel. I was going to be a literary darling. I was going to be I was going to be the next fill in the blank. No, it was a very serious, serious, brooding, melancholy, autobiographical, all the stereotypical things of a first novel. No, it was in no way a mystery thriller. What I actually had never really read a great number of mystery thrillers when I wrote Short Drop. I came to it somewhat innocently and almost by accident, and partly because I was just doing something that I wanted. I had no plan on having it published. It was for me. So I just wanted to write something fun. I wanted something that wasn't going to be autobiographical. I worked really hard for it not to be autobiographical. I tried to create a character that was not particularly like myself, and out of that came, an unexpected career.
That's really awesome. And I love that, like that finding your genre almost, because it takes a lot to get there and find like what kind of speaks to you. So what was your favorite thing to write in this book? Like, did you have a favorite section or a favorite character or anything?
Well, that's a good question. I felt a great deal of affinity for Peter. He's one of my favorite characters in the book. I really liked all of the thinking about what Paleogenesis would look on the inside, like that if you were going to have a company that offered human cloning, how would you, because it's such a strange idea that you would go into a place and that was keeping a duplicate of your body just there on the off chance that something terrible would happen to you. And if it did, they would download your consciousness into that body so that you could carry on. So that would be a fairly discomforting idea. So trying to imagine what the inside of Paleogenesis would look like, how they would treat you, how they would try and make you, distract you sort of by magic, like look over here while we're doing this weird thing over there.
Let's get your nails done and
exactly.
Do this. I love that part because it's like it makes it even more creepy what they're doing.
Right, for sure. That was one of the other things very early on that I decided that this was going to be something that wasn't available to someone like me. This was only going to be something that was available to someone in the 1%. That would only further exacerbate the tensions around the technology. That this is very much something that is a 1% service, which is only going to further separate them from everyone else in the country. And so that was a big part of the conceit, was that this was not going to be a part of a standard insurance package. Like this was, you've got 30 million lying around. We'll give you a human clone, and that distance from it, that sort of elite quality to it, I think is, that the prejudice in the book against cloning is partly just against the idea of clones, which makes people uneasy, but it's also I can't have one. This is you rubbing your unbelievable financial advantage right in my face, that if I die, I'm dead, but if you die, you get another chance. And how are people going to react to that level? There's such a wealth disparity in this country as is. All these different ways that the very wealthy just live incredibly different lives than we do.
And then making it be like, I'm going to die and you never did. Like, well, not never, but also like you have less of a time limit.
Correct. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, that was something that I thought was also really cool, was how you had it be that it was like the gossip columns were always like, which celebrity is secretly a clone? And then how people would stir up their own rumors to try and have their fame get big. Like, I thought that was something that was so interesting. The way that you showed people like almost abusing this privilege that they might not even have had.
Well, that's sort of the interesting thing is that, you know, you're going to have both things at the same time. That at the same time that we are sort of appalled by the wealth discrepancy, we're also, you know, as a culture, fascinated by the very rich.
Oh.
We're fascinated by Jeff Bezos flying into space on his own rocket. We are, you know, fascinated by the Paris Hiltons and the tech billionaires and the things that they, you know, that it's both things at the same time. It's both an anger and a jealousy and a curiosity. So you have that, like, both clones are cool, while clones are, you know, that both of those tensions will exist culturally at the same time, sometimes in the same person, sometimes sentence to sentence. Yeah. It was really interesting to explore and sort of go see how far I could take it as an idea.
Definitely. And I think you also showed, like, in this country currently, and I'm in the US, and I think you are too. I think you said that earlier. But in this country, it's so polarizing. You have to have an opinion on everything. And everyone that she interacts with in this book has an opinion on the cloning.
Yes.
And I think that's just a little way that it made the book almost more real to me. You know, like, it's how everyone is going, oh, well, I think this, but I don't think this part. I believe this. And everyone has to inject their 2 cents into the story.
Right. And an interesting thing that is sort of, I don't know whether it's taken over the culture. I think probably it's always been there, but it is unfashionable to not have an opinion. It is not, you know, and it's sort of something that's taken me a long time to do. Well, someone will ask me something, I'm like, I don't know. I don't have enough information to have an opinion on that subject. It's a really difficult thing to say and to acknowledge, but it actually, for me, it feels empowering to just say, I would need to read more about that. I don't know. And that, to some extent, I think that keeps me out of trouble, because you have that, all right, you're on Twitter and you see a story and there's just an immediate reaction before all the information is even there. The need to have the opinion before I know what happened is a pretty powerful force, and to be the first. There's almost a competition to be who can get, you know, and 2 hours later, your opinion was a terrible take. I mean, I looked at the reaction to Simone Biles at the Olympics. Was a fascinating study in, you know, she withdrew from that event, and immediately everyone had opinions. People who had never done gymnastics, people who didn't know a damn thing about how dangerous a sport that is. And, you know, there was a great article in the Washington Post a couple of days later about, they call it the Twirlies. And it's where a gymnast loses physical sense of where they are in the air, and their muscle memory goes away. And that's what she got. She lost the ability to track her movement. And the things she was doing would kill her. Like, it's not like tennis where I forget how to swing a tennis racket. I just don't hit the ball. If these gymnasts don't have that total confidence, and there's no time to think. They're just they're going move to move to move to move, spin, 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 land. And if they lose that midair, they're going to break their necks. But no one waited for an explanation. It was immediately, you know, she's this, she's that, she's a coward, she's just these horrific opinions that by people who had no idea what they were talking about.
Yeah. And then everyone goes silent about it because
yes.
because then they realize they were wrong, but they can't change.
Then they're like,
opinion.
oops. And they scrub my timeline. Let's get all of that out of there. But, so, it's that, like, I'm trying to learn a little, I'm just going to take a minute. I'm just going to listen. Just listen. Let me actually learn about what this is before I decide that I should weigh in with an opinion.
Yeah.
But it's tough. It's tough to do because everyone's talking, and you feel that pull to be part of it, to be part of that conversation. And the characters the characters she encounters in the book have never met clones, don't know any clones, but they have to have an opinion. You can't not have an opinion. Who would we be if we didn't have an opinion? We are our opinions in a weird way. In a social media environment, we are our opinions more than we are ourselves. Okay, now I sound entirely like William Gibson. That was a very William Gibson thing to say. So
it's cool. It sounded really fancy. So I was just like,
smart,
in this. The last person I was talking to, Charles Arthur, we talked all about this because he released a book all about like social media and the polarization. So I've kind of got that on the brain. But yeah, so all those takes, I'm like, yes, I'm in for it. But the book really did make me think of that. And like the way that even in the book, Constance says like her generation is less obsessed with social media as the previous one, me. I'm the previous generation. She keeps dissing. But she says,
I don't know that it's dissing. I don't think I really didn't mean that as a disrespect. It's more that I always think of history and generations as sort of pendulums, and that they swing back and forth. And not just your generation, but also mine, we have all collectively basically said, I'm not too worried about my personal private information. I'm going to live very much online. I'm going to put Google on my phone, even though I have read that Google is tracking everything I do. I'm going to use Google Maps, knowing that Google basically keeps track of everywhere I go.
Or Facebook with all the the data leaks and everything.
Right. And we have made we just sort of accept that as a reality. And I always see the next generation sort of reacting against that and swing the other way. So it's less of a diss than just a hypothetical that, how will the next generation, next generation go further, or will it go back the other way?
Mm. I was more laughing at it because as a teenager, it's a little. As a teenager, it's a little weird to see someone talking about your generation as the old generation. But when she's saying that, even though it's less online, it's less social media, they still always have to have an opinion on everything. And I think that's interesting that aspect stayed the same, even 20 some years in the future.
Well, I bet 500 years ago, all the peasants in England were like or 300 years ago, all the peasants in England were going, those damn Americans, they're ungrateful, and they'd never met any Americans. And it's like, the stupid American Revolution, they're a bunch of idiots. I have a feeling like the need to have an opinion on everything may long predate social media. I think social media, just like a lot of things, just the speed of the transactions is so fast now. You look at it in politics. I mean, I would hate to be the president now, as opposed to say 50 years ago. I mean, 50 years ago, when you were president, if something happened in Argentina, you would have 3 days to react to it before the newspapers even found out about it. There would be this delay. You could think about it. You could formulate it. Now, if something happens in Argentina, the president's got to respond to it in 5 minutes.
Yep.
There's no time to sort of pause and to think and reflect. I have to have the right answer now. And we don't. Like, we're not, we have to, but we're not actually any smarter than we were 50 years ago. We just have to be quicker. And that makes us wrong, or gives us the potentiality to be wrong so much more often than, I mean, not that people were infallible 50 years ago, but you at least had time to sort of think about it before you said something really, really dumb that was going to get you in a lot of trouble.
And it also puts all of those things on a microscope too, because it shows like, oh, you said this one wrong thing all of these years ago. Well, we found it and no one's happy about it.
Oh my God.
There are a lot of cases
my generation
where
says that.
People have said stuff that it's like, okay, that was extremely bigoted. Like, wow, that was really awful. I can't believe anyone in their right mind would say that. But also there's sometimes where it's like, okay, but also they were replying really quick, and this was 30 years ago.
Right. And
so
I'm a Gen Xer, and I mean, if there's one thing that every single person from my generation says was, thank God my childhood was not on the internet. Thank God my teen years were not. I didn't have to have that. I got to be stupid in private. You guys have to be stupid in public, and then, you know. And what's interesting is, will you bear the consequences for it, or will the standards for behavior drop as they are dropping? Because right now we get away with things that people, not us, but people do things that 30 years ago would have been the end of their career. And now it's just, okay. Because
then everybody forgets about it.
To drop our standards.
It's like the media cycle. Everyone forgets about it immediately.
Well, right. That's the other thing, is all you have to do is just wait it out and wait for the next person to do something even more egregiously stupid than you did, and you're home free. And then we're just moving on.
Yeah, it's great. Just great. But yeah, your book, I felt like there were elements of it from where I am in it that really hit on some of those things. And I thought that was really interesting. And especially in a book that is not about that it was exploring those sort of themes and stuff.
I think that's where you sort of get into the world building. It's just having the whole thing, not every single thing is going to be explored in depth, but any, like in the theater, if you go to a play, right, you sit in the audience and you look at the stage, it looks beautiful. You walk around to the back of the stage, it's just plywood held up with some 2x4s. There's no paint, there's no anything. And that's a little bit what a book is you as the reader. I want you, when you encounter the world, for the world to feel real and full without necessarily having to open all the drawers and being, wait, there's nothing in this drawer. This drawer was just for show. So it's a little bad, because I always find like books slog down. And that's the interesting thing with science fiction, is that oftentimes in science fiction, they want to open every drawer. Like, ooh, what's in this drawer? What's in that drawer? And then 10 pages later, they've been through all the drawers, and what happened to the story? And so keeping that balance of like this, because at the end of the day, this book is about Constance. It's about Con, and everything else was in service to her. I didn't want her to be in service to the world, if that made any sense.
I think that definitely came across, because a lot of times in sci-fi, and I love reading about like world building and all of the little aspects of the different worlds, but also that gets really hard to read after a while. And sometimes you don't need to know every single detail of, this is what phones look like, and this is what this looks like, and this is what happened 500 years ago to make this event. And right. And I felt like this book did not get off track.
I mean, world building is like an iceberg. Okay. Ideally, to my mind, the reader should only see that little bit that's sticking out of the water, but they should feel the weight of the rest of that iceberg under the water. That feeling of like weight and believability, without necessarily having to look at every single inch of that iceberg. You only want to show just enough. You do the work. Like, I have the whole iceberg. Like, I could show you 1,000 pages of like iceberg notes, but I'm only showed you enough that you'd be like, yes, I know that iceberg is there if I kept going. But it's and my editor was like, can we lose a couple pages of this? Because you want to be like, you do all this work, like, but I've got all this stuff about the iceberg. And they're like, no one cares. Just tell the damn story. So it is good to have an editor who will sort of like rein an author in, because we're just like, oh, but I did all this work. Let me show you my work. Don't show the work.
Definitely. All right. Well, I think we're running out of time here. I just have one last question, and that is, what do you have coming up?
Well, I am in the closing stages of this companion book to Constance, which is called Chance. It takes place in 2042 in California, and I'm really excited about the ways that it extends and continues the story and continues to explore some of the issues that this world has given me to play with. And I'm really excited about it. I'm hoping to be done with it later this year, and fingers crossed that we'll see it out sometime late next year. But that is all conjectural at this point.
Awesome. All right. I cannot wait to read that one. Feel free to come back on the show when that one publishes.
Anytime, Molly. This was
I would
a lot
love to
of
have
fun.
you back on.
Yeah.
And everyone go and read Constance right now. Please do it. For Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
I'm Matthew Fitzsimmons.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after. The end.
The end.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. This episode is hosted by Molly Southgate. It is edited by Rob Southgate and produced by Southgate Media Group. You can get in touch with the show at readbetweenthelines@gmail.com, or you can send us a voicemail at 708-887-9473. That was 708-887-9473. You can also find us on Instagram at Read Between the Lines Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.